and remote or distant, but happy to be able to bring this presentation to you. And after obviously a long winter for all of us, both due to COVID and cabin fever compounding it, hopefully this will bring a little bit of ideas and some anticipation for coming spring, and maybe some things you can do around your place. I'm calling the presentation Living with the Land, Our Birchwood Home, and my wife Connie and I, we live at Birchwood Lake in the northern Kettle Moraine. And we've been working on this land for more than 35 years. And I want to share with you a little history of the work we've done here, not just to showcase what we have done, but I think there'll be examples for probably almost every kind of landowner out there. We'll show you what we've done immediately around the home using wildflowers and native plant gardens. So for those with smaller lots, maybe some ideas of things you can do right there. We've also worked in the woodland, restoring an oak-hickory forest. So for woodland owners, hopefully some hints for you as well. And we've also taken an agricultural field, converted that to prairie and a prairie nursery. And below the home, there's also a wetland community. So we cover a whole gamut of the different natural communities that we've worked with and tried to restore to a little bit more of a natural state and a much richer diversity. So as I mentioned, we live in the northern Kettle Moraine. The house here is located on a ridge, a glacial ridge just above the small lake. So there's a steep slope between us and the lake itself, and a wetland community that borders that. So Birchwood Lake is about 35 acres in size, a small lake, and it was actually my wife's father who developed the land around the lake, and there was a large section of land that remained in the family. It was, in a sense, not real suitable because it didn't have direct access to the lake, but we ended up with all the wildlife habitat as a consequence of the wetland and the forested land on that steep slope. So we began to work on the land in 1983, and we really didn't build there for another 2 years. So it gave us a chance to get familiar with the land, to explore it, and of course the first thing we did was to establish hiking trails. And here on the map you can actually see in red are the hiking trails. There's about 3/4 mile of trail that wind throughout the different corners. The blue indicates, of course, the shoreline and a freshwater spring that emerges below the house out of the wetland. Our first trail was in the uplands, and this was easy to do. We just simply got a push mower and just cut a trail through the old field, and that provided the first access lane into the uplands. In the woodland, there were cow paths. It had been grazed in the past, so we used some of the old cow path for one of our major hiking trails. And here we see a section down below. This was an attempt to develop a small gravel road. It was never completed. It never really utilized. But we provided that flat surface for the hiking trail, and after being abandoned, it was heavily invaded by multiflora rose, which is what you see here. So there's just this tangle of barbed wire of the multiflora rose, so we cut a trail through there to give us some opening and access. And here you can see the actual trail that is cut into the land, and the first corridor that we opened up. Once that had actually been opened, we now had a walking trail and an access into that portion of the land. And as you can see, this is multiflora rose still dominating both sides of it. So over the next several years, we began to work to each side of the trail, starting to work on those invasives. So the hiking trail provided us with a nice walking surface, kept our impact to that narrow corridor, gave us access to the land, and also that corridor to work off of to be able to manage and restore the land on either side and throughout the forested sites. And here we see several years later, the multiflora had been almost entirely removed from this portion of the land, and it's fairly easy to get out. The largest ones, you just got to watch you don't get hooked on them, push them back a little bit, cut the upper parts, and if they're real large, you can cut and treat the stump, otherwise grub it out, which we did for most of it. And by just removing this invasive, it allowed more space and sunlight to the forest floor and gave the opportunity for the remnant wildflowers that were there to come back and to recover and reclaim the forest understory. So many years later, here we see that same area completely cleared of the multiflora rose and other invasives and dominated by native vegetation. And this has been in more recent years. It's all matured. The trees have gotten bigger. The plants have become much more of a carpet throughout the area. And after several decades, we actually have a very nice restored woodland understory. We use these trails throughout the year. They provide that access for all 4 seasons. In fact, today we just went out for the first time in a while. We snowshoed the land. So this is our year-round access to the land, both to enjoy it and as an area to work from and assess our work. In the first few years, we had also developed just off there a small campsite, and we would picnic there, and we even camped overnight on weekends. And this gives us a chance to work on the land throughout those long weekends and to get very familiar with it. So long before we ever began to even decide of building a house, we really had not only established a hiking trail, but we had a good sense of the land, knew where we wanted to build with minimal impact, and to try to make this a permanent home for ourselves. That same campsite, we still use it to today, and this is a place that we'll commonly enjoy an evening fire or afternoon fire almost any time throughout the year. I mentioned that we're located on rather a steep glacial ridge, so I've got a few trails that run parallel to that ridge. And because of the steep slope, I simply make a small retaining wall with a couple of trees that I removed right now, a couple of elm or a few dying ash, and just simply take a few of the larger branches, cut stakes, peg those in, lay the log, trench that into the side, and just simply take a shovel just to cut a flat surface. And that gives a nice smooth walking trail across this really steep slope. So it's pretty low tech, using the materials right off the land, and provides for a safer walking area. There also was an area that was heavily eroded. This was during that attempt to build that small road, and to both create a retaining wall as well as easy walking, we put a stairway in. And many years later, on the steepest part of the slope, we also had a stairway that goes down toward that campsite. So these are some of the minimal developments we've added into our hiking trail system. In 1985 is when we actually began construction of the home. And here we're looking from the road up toward the hillside across an agricultural field where we first drove into, and this would be where the driveway would be established. And of course, before the house could begin, they had to construct the driveway. And quite honestly, it was more of a shock and almost seemed more destructive than I had expected. And so when we saw the heavy equipment come in and literally bulldoze its way to create a narrow driveway corridor and grade the edges to it, we realized that this was going to be an impact to the land, perhaps a little more severe than we'd anticipated. And we really made it our commitment that we would, from here on, work very diligently to restore the land, to establish more native plant material, and to really rehabilitate this area and create much more of a diverse and natural communities. The site we chose for the home was on the upper part of the ridge overlooking the lake and the forest. In order to build the house, we only cut 3 trees. One was a dead elm and a small clump of basswood. And it turned out most of this site was dominated by poison ivy, so it became a real easy way to get rid of a huge poison ivy patch on top of it by putting the house on. If you look in the lower portion of the picture, you'll see a bit of a retaining wall. This was from some dead elms and the few trees that we cut. We built that so that from the excavation process, the dirt wasn't going to be washing down into the woods. So they brought the backhoe in to dig out the basement. We built that into the hillside with a poured basement. So the first floor is built into the hillside, and we built a relatively small house, 30 by 30 feet. So the back portion of the lower section is the basement, 2 rooms down below, and then a living quarter up on top. So we made a rather modest home for it. And you can see the retaining wall holding back that debris from excavation. When the house was completed, we used a wood siding. And in order to blend it in as best as we could, my wife Connie actually peeled bark off a couple different trees and took that to a paint store and had them match a stain that looked pretty much like the color of a lot of the tree bark. And so here you see how it recesses in and blends in very nicely, even with the fall forest. And in wintertime, the house is barely noticeable. Here's a picture out from across the lake, and you can see how the house is pretty well tucked away. And quite honestly, this was taken many years ago, so the trees have matured, and we've actually lost, during the summertime, most of the view of the lake, which is fine. We've got a nice forest surrounding us. And you can imagine the difference from, say, building a 3-story house and painting it white compared to here, tucking it into the hillside and using a natural colored stain and trying to blend in with everything. When the house was completed, of course, there was a lot of disturbance immediately around it, and this is where the landscaping began. So we'll start a little bit with the landscaping right around the immediate home. Just to stabilize the soil, we've seeded it with an annual rye, just to have something grow quickly, hold it down, and mulched it. And so a little bit of lawns grew to begin with, and from there we decided to remove some of that lawn over time and convert this to native wildflowers. We also put a few shade trees in. You're looking here at the west side of the house, so on those summer afternoons, this part of the house will get pretty warm, so we now have some large trees that shade that and keep the house much cooler. First thing Connie did was to dig out a little bit of the sod along the foundation of the house to keep out into the weeds and to bring in native plants. These were got right out of the forest and forest edge and were planted here. So we see a nice mix, some asters, goldenrods, a few other sort of forest edge species that were here. These worked well in the first few years when this was a very intensive sun in the summer. With the shade trees growing, we've actually converted this to much more shade tolerant plants and much shorter stature plants. So the conditions have changed over the years as trees have grown, and so have the plants that we have underneath. We also did a small wildflower garden next to the walkway, and we didn't want to have just a straight rectangular look to the border. We want a little bit more of a natural flowing curvilinear border. So we experimented with a garden hose, just laid that out and started to move that a little bit to give it kind of a sweep and to develop our border. So this was a nice way to give us a feeling of just how we might want to have that flowing edge. We started to see poison ivy actually coming in through the sod, and so this was smothered with old newspapers. Just a couple of sheets of newspaper were laid down on top of some bark mulch that we had around these small trees. That would then smother any of the plants that are trying to emerge. And Connie got the idea of using what some people refer to as a sand sandwich. And what you have is on the left side, this is a mushroom compost. We got that from a mushroom farm. On the right side, this is a coarse grained sand. So above the newspaper, we do about 2 inches of the mushroom compost, about 1 or 2 inches of sand for some drainage, and then as a seeding bed or a transplanting bed, some more mushroom compost on top. So here we see that upper layer of the mushroom compost, and very early spring when the wildflowers are just beginning to emerge, we identified the various species we were interested in, dug those out, popped them in, kept them nicely watered, and within just a few weeks they took very quickly. And here you can see that nice flowing edge to the garden and a nice mix of native wildflowers, including early meadow rue, Solomon's seal, Solomon's plume, a number of other common wildflowers right from around here, columbines and other we put in. Years later, you see that we have more wild geranium, and I like wild geranium. It's a nice flower, and I would say for anybody who's got a weed problem, this is a very hardy native wildflower. Does very well and may compete very well in weedy areas. We found, however, it can be a little bit aggressive in these small gardens. We're starting to remove it, but we have obviously much more shade tolerant plants now growing under these large shade trees. There was also an area right next to the driveway where some of the excavation dirt was left over. So we just leveled out that mound, bordered it with some stones. And this was the entrance of our trail going into the woods. And rather than having the grass coming from the edge of the woods all the way up to the house, we wanted to have the forest coming up to the house rather than lawn reaching all the way out to the edges. So here again, we smothered another stand of poison ivy and some other weeds with newspapers and more of the mushroom compost and sand. And we once again just found some plugs from areas in the forest. In the background, you'll see May apple on the right. To the left of that, that's starry Solomon's plume. And then we did have some wild geranium in here, some shooting stars, Pennsylvania sedge. So these were a number of the different kinds of wildflowers that we put into this section. And here you see this is within only 2 seasons, how quickly these things take root and come back the following spring. And you see how that whole forest now reaches out to almost to the edge of the house. Down below the house, there was some large washed stone left over from the basement under the poured floor. And we just left this as sort of a walking patio area. A few years later, we decided to make some major improvements, and we had this put in with retaining wall and cobblestone. So that finished off that section very nicely and provided a nice walking area on that side of the house. And then around that lower portion of that patio, we again planted native wildflowers. And you'll see this is the large stand of wild ginger. There's a Solomon's plume, starry Solomon's plume, and quite a bit of early meadow rue that make up these stands here. And over the years, the trees have certainly matured. The house has become a little more tucked in and hidden. And you'll see that as the forest and the wildflowers have grown right up around the house, rather than, as I see a lot of people, my cynical sense is people move to the country, first thing they do is cut down the trees, and then they plant the lawn and build their house in the middle of it. This is a way to really bring that forest around it and blend in with things. And of course, that brings the wildlife close to home as well. And not to mention that the shade trees have really reduced the hot summer temperatures within the house, so natural cooling that way. I've also worked with stone, especially limestone, and here's one of my projects. We did a stone walkway to the house, and I wanted to add a patio to it. So I went to one of the local quarries, got some large slabs of stone, and moved those around as little as possible. This one here was over 800 pounds. And the trick is you move the big ones first and you build everything around it. You don't want to move them more than once. So it's like pieces of a puzzle. Just lay those down, try to get the edges as close as you can. Originally, I cut all my edges with a hammer and cold chisel. More recently, I've just got a concrete saw, and I find that saves a lot more time, gives a nice cut, and works a lot easier. So I just cut that stone, laid it together, and here we have then the finished product, and native limestone then rather than concrete for our patio and walkway. Right out the front door was an area we had bird feeders. We tried some wildflowers. There was a nice stand of gray dogwood right behind it. We never quite were pleased with the look of it, and we always wanted to add a water garden. So this began the next project. This was to do a small water garden or a little pond. This one I excavated myself rather than a preformed one. I used a series of flags for the different depths and contours of it, and just by shovel began to cut it out and sculpt it. There is a slight slope to the land, so to keep my levels for the different tiers, I had my 2x4 and level out here, and just started to scrape and sculpt that. And I've got it dropping down 1 foot, then 2 feet, and the lowest part 3 feet deep. I got a large rubber liner. This is for that construction grade rubber roofing material. Works extremely well. I've had it hold up for almost 20 years. I just replaced it a few years ago. So this is I found to be extremely durable, and you can shape it any way you want. So we just folded that in there, and then just began to add water to have everything settle into place. And notice the plants. We got some plastic pots, and we just went down to the wetland and just early spring identified a few of the dried stems of the plants that I wanted as specimens. And you need a little rock in the bottom of the pot, basically as ballast, so as things get a little top heavy, they won't tip over. And you just take that little clump of sod and just push it right into that pot and just have it sit where it's going to be at water level. I then finished it off back to the quarry again, and I got weathered limestone this time and used that for the edging. And cut those stones to fit nice and neatly around it and bordered it this way. And so now we have a nice finished water garden. You'll see the native plants in there. And what I found interesting is that for those small potted plants, I was really targeting one particular species, but you end up with a whole community. So at one point, I was looking for a single iris. I had marsh ferns come up with it, some sedges. You never know what else you're going to get. So it makes for a nice little mixture of things. Also added a circulating pump. So this is what I call my electric waterfall. And we've got the nice sound of moving water. It's not only, say, pleasing as you step out the door and you hear that, but it's also very attractive for birds. They use it as a nice bird bath, and it also brings them in. So it's been a very nice addition to it to add this water garden, make good use of this little corner. And some of the guests that we have at the pond include different kinds of frogs, lots of green frogs, as you see in the lower right. A few leopard frogs come in, and a whole host of birds use it as a bird bath. Here we'll see the Swainson's thrush and blue jay that are bathing within the pond. In wintertime, we just leave the plants as is. They freeze naturally out in nature, so that's what we do, is we just leave the pots in there and everything just freezes. And so you just let it go and it just come right back on their own again in spring. However, one little precaution, if you're going to take your pump out, do it before the ice forms. So here we see the finished product, the pond, the patio, the stone walkways, the various wildflower gardens, and even the trees around the house that they've matured over the years. And what we really see is a unified landscape as one project after another is done over the years, and eventually they tie together. All these individual elements come together into a bit more of a flowing landscape. So it doesn't just happen overnight, it takes time, but if you have a chance to live on land for a while and work with it and plan like this, you'll start to see this really mature and come together. Now, back in the 1990s and early 2000s, I was working at Lake Baikal in Siberia, and I was really impressed with the Russian banya. This is their steam bath, or essentially a Russian-style sauna. And I always told myself I was going to build one. So we did that also not too far from the house. And so there's a sitting changing room and also the steam room itself, which is wood-fired. And I spent an entire year to build that, get it all done inside and out, and use a half-side log siding on that. And this works very well, especially in the cold weather and throughout wintertime. That steam room with its wood-fired stove, I can get that up to 185 degrees in a little over 2 hours. So it's a nice relaxing way and a nice addition to our home. We planted prairie around that as well, so you see that tucked among the red cedars and the shade trees with the prairie flowers growing around it. We always had a wood chip trail from the house to the banya, and it was time to make a little improvement with that. So back to the quarry one more time, got a couple more tons of limestone. And again, I laid some stones in for edging and began to hand cut these and worked my way down. It was about 3 weeks worth of work to cut everything and lay this, and completed a nice walkway and tying a walk that wraps right around the pond, ties in from the house, one way out to the driveway, the other way to the banya and to the hiking trails. So again, these are improvements for that and tying it all together even more. And you see as the stone has weathered over the years and taken on a little bit more of a muted color. So here's where the house sits, where we've done our work, the long driveway, and this was the agricultural field that we slowly converted to prairie. Before we even started with the driveway, this was its last year that it was in corn, and you can still see the last of the corn stubble before we began. The driveway went in, and then adjacent to that, we started with the prairie project. We burned off all the old dead material, had a farmer till this for us and prepare the site, and we hand collected the seed from remnant sites and roadsides and came up with a mixture that we thought was compatible with this soil type, and planted that. The first year, of course, it's just simply competing with the weeds, and we're really establishing root. And the plants are slowly coming. The second year, as you see here, they're starting to put in their first flowers. After that, we do the prescribed burn. That helps to set back the weeds and also prepare everything for the maturing plants. And within a few years, we've converted this to a nice, rich prairie. It continues to change as every year is a little bit different. Things certainly have matured. We've now cataloged 78 species of native wildflowers that we've introduced here. And among those, we actually got special permits. Connie got that through DNR for 3 threatened species, state threatened species that we're growing here as well. So it's a way to be able to bring some of those back. 1 year for her birthday, I had somebody make this sign. This is Tom Schultz and a fellow in the state forest who did all the signage, did that for us. Tom did the artwork. So we refer to this now formally as our Birchwood Lake Nature Preserve. The prairie comes right down to the road, and to give it a little bit of a border so that when things are all dried out in late fall, winter, and early spring, it doesn't appear to some people as if it's a neglected wheat field. So we put up a split rail fence. I mow right in front of that, between that and the road. So it gives a little more intentional look. And of course, by midsummer, it's in full bloom, and it really captures a lot of attention, and people get an idea of what we're really doing here. Probably some of the greatest compliments I got is when I see people who walk in the road stop and take pictures and try to capture their own images of what we've planted here. So there's a whole variety of different flowers, from common to less common, that we have here. And that includes, of course, the yellow coneflower, Turk's cap lily, spiderwort, columbine. We have great blue lobelias. And this is cream gentian, and cream gentian is on the state threatened list. And there were 2 sites in the northern Kettle Moraine, the only places I could find it even remaining in the whole county anymore. And I was able to collect seed from one of the roadsides, and lucky we did. We have a lot of it growing these days, and that site is now entirely gone. And the other site has just, I counted maybe 15 plants that remain. So we literally saved this plant from and have the local genetic variety growing here. We also have bottle gentian, another close relative. Hoary vervain, which grows real well in the areas where there's less competition, like right along the edge of the driveway. We even tried introducing the lupins. And we also have the 4 different silphium species. This is the prairie dock. Now, this has been an experiment with the prairie, and we have found on a small site like this that some plants are just not entirely compatible. So there are some things that we do not recommend anymore for small wildflower gardens or smaller scale prairies. And this is one of the instances. This is cup plant. I got this a little bit west of Fond du Lac County, put it in. There's a nice moist site here right below the garage. It grew to 12, 14 feet tall, and it was getting out of control. We finally had to remove this entirely. Also, rosinweed, another silphium we put in, we found to be just too aggressive for this small site, and we started to control it. Now we're working to eliminate it. So there are some things that through our own trial and error and experiment that we've learned are just not entirely compatible. So we've learned a lot. And of course, we can pass on a lot of hints to other people to help shortcut a lot of this. So yes, we made some mistakes. We changed our mind, but we also remind ourselves that this was also in the early stages of experimentation. And so we were doing things by trial and error, and we've certainly learned an awful lot during the process. As you get into late summer and fall, we have the late season plants with the goldenrods and the asters. This is a rigid goldenrod, and then also the asters. I saw a question come up about how did we remove the cup plant. We basically just grubbed it out, just cut it all down and just grubbed out the root. It's not that deeply rooted, so we're able, if you cut enough of it, that got rid of it. Here again, real late season, you see many things have gone to seed. The asters are coming into bloom, smooth aster, and the New England aster, as well as mountain mint. So some late season plants that go well into the first several frosts even. So it gives us a nice variety of color throughout the whole summer and fall growing season, and of course has become quite the butterfly garden. Asters are some of the last bloomers. We've got 6 species of asters, and you'll see some of them, like here, the smooth aster that comes up in a couple of different color types even, from off-white to pink, lavender, and blue. There's been another benefit from the prairie, and that is this. It's acting as a natural snow fence. Before we had the prairie, we had a lot of problems in harsh winters with heavy snow, with drifting on the driveway. And so this was one instance where I saw that there was quite a drift on the driveway. I walked down, took a look at that drift, and I figured if I could drive fast enough, I could just blast through that and I could shovel it out later on. It took me about 4.5 seconds to drive down there and another 4 hours to shovel my truck out. So these were the serious problems we had of drifting when this was a wide open agricultural field. But since the prairie's been in, it acts as a snow fence. The wind-blowing snow gets lodged in there, and we hardly get any drifting. Sure, I have to have the driveway cleared when we get a heavy snowstorm, but we don't have the large mounds of drifts out there. So this has really been another benefit for us. As I mentioned, we grow a lot of prairie plants here, and Connie has also got a greenhouse where she's been able to start an awful lot of plants. So we've had a nursery where she collects the seed, grows these as seedlings here, and then outplants them, and has even given away and sold to some of the plants over the years. Now this little greenhouse is only 10 by 12 feet, and here you see two images left and right of the trays that Connie has on the floor and on her table. And she has literally grown tens of thousands of seedlings here of many, many different species. So just a small greenhouse like this, it's really unbelievable the huge number of seedlings that you can grow. And she used this then as her first generation of seedlings that went into the nursery. So when she had the nursery, she started out with a landscape fabric. That's just so you don't have a lot of weeds competing with the plants. And she wanted these in single stands so that it was a lot easier to collect the seed from the different species. Put straw down as hiking or walking trails between the different beds from which you could pick. And then year after year, she just planted different beds, one row after another. Of course, prairie plants are very drought tolerant, but during that first year, you have to water them to make sure they get a good start, and especially with the landscape fabric around it that can dry out and bake the plant pretty much. So yes, you do have to water it pretty heavily that first season, and maybe during the most stressful times, the second season. After that, they've taken established deep roots, and there's no longer any need. They'll tolerate almost any weather we get. So here you see the plants that are coming up in their second year. The seedlings are just emerging, and then behind it are the more mature stands of previous years. So each year she put in different beds, just kept moving along until she had a full nursery established. And so here you can see the different single species stands. We had a large area of New Jersey tea, which unfortunately the rabbits like, so she had to fence that. And here we see on one side, the right, this is the prairie bush clover. On the left side, you'll see nodding wild onion. In the foreground, there's a single wild quinine, another state threatened species. She also had a large stand of rough blazing star, and I never realized how much of a desirable food this was for the finches. And she really had a race to try to get the seed as soon as it matured before the goldfinches were to eat it all. And there was a single day when I walked out here and I had 125 goldfinches fly out of here. But sure, she got enough for her own needs, and we fed a lot of finches, so that worked out well. She also used the landscape fabric not just for establishing the prairie, but also wildflower gardens. So for a smaller garden where you want to do individual plants and you want to select the species, the different colors and heights of them, this also is a very nice technique. So here right by the greenhouse, she did a small garden. This was actually over our septic system. And then down by the edge of the driveway and road, this was a corner that never really was that well established with prairie. And the problem is because it was such a narrow corner when the tractor was plowing this, making his sweep, he never quite got to the far edge to till everything. And so it ended up a little weedy. We just rototilled that and decided to start over. We reused some old landscape cloth that we had and put some new fabric toward the back. And we also did right by the garage a rain garden. And so from what was coming from the downspout off the roof, we decided to collect that in a rain garden. And here we found another fast way of cutting the holes in the fabric. Originally, Connie was on her hands and knees with the scissors cutting these small holes for each seedling, which obviously is very time consuming. Well, being plastic fabric, it's easily melts. So you got to be a little careful with your touch, but just a blowtorch like this and just touch it. You just open up your little holes and you just start popping your plants in. So here they are right out of the greenhouse from the trays, the different kinds of plants, the shorter ones to the front, taller ones to the back, the most, the ones that tolerate the wettest soil go into the lowest spot for the rain garden. And we just pop those in, water them for that first season, make sure they get through. Here you see some more mature plants of the first year and then replacing a few and expanding the garden the next year. So 2 seasons that went in. After that, you see the plants nicely matured, and I don't even see where the water is collected then from in the rain garden. And we had a lot of the marsh milkweed or swamp milkweed, which grew in the wettest spot. the giant St. John's wort and real other plants that were not that common in the rest of the prairie. So this also gave a little accent by a little bit moister soil. Now I mentioned we used the landscape fabric. That was for the first couple of years just to suppress the weeds. As the prairie plants kept getting larger, you had to cut the larger holes in spring for the maturing plant to grow through. And then after a few years, we just simply removed that and pulled that back. And then we would take side oats grama and little blue stem and seeded that in between as a way to compete with any weeds that would now come in after having suppressed them for so many years. So here we see the prairie plants coming back up, and then just throw the seed, cast that over the top, and try to give a little more of a ground cover throughout it. Now Connie ran her nursery for about 30 years and has in the meantime retired from that. There's a lot of other producers out there. It became hard to compete. It also was very labor intensive. And so she's abandoned single species stands. There's still some out there, but we've blended more plants in with it, trying to create more of a prairie community. Now we do have a trail that winds around the edge and through the prairie, and this is maintained simply by mowing. And we've also led a lot of tours on our property over the years. University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee had a class that came up every year. And this is the Fond du Lac Audubon, also different chapters of wild ones. We've hosted all of them during the summertime to show them in person what we've done on our land, to share some of the hints and ideas with people of what they can do to enhance their own backyard. And here's Connie, outstanding in her field. The prairie that you see now, this is quite different. As I say, it's changed over the years. It's no longer single species stands as the nursery. And even so, from year to year, some plants come and go. And so the look of the prairie, its composition does change. But it's always in full bloom by midsummer, whatever that sort of mixture and combination of things that we have out there, ever changing. We also did a shortgrass prairie on a small knoll with, it was very gravelly, very thin soil site, and so we decided to convert that to a little different type of prairie. This area had been grazed in the past and then abandoned, and it was dominated by Kentucky bluegrass, and it was also very heavily infested by spotted knapweed. Here's someone helping Connie to dig out the spotted knapweed. We're using old steak knives just to cut into the roots. We tried a lot of different methods, and here you can see just how thick that spotted knapweed was. The densest areas, we just took the landscape fabric and just smothered it, put it right over the top, and let that just bake for an entire summer or two, and let that really heat up to kill those roots. That was quite effective. We did try some herbicide. That wasn't always that effective. We didn't want to use that much of it to broadcast the whole area. We tried hand digging it a couple of different ways. We eventually did dominate this stuff with our efforts. We're able to eradicate most of it. It still comes in small numbers, but now I just look forward in early summer when the first ones are blooming. And it does have a bit of a taproot, but when the soil is moist, just with a sharp knife, you can just dig down next to that root, give a little cut, and that usually kills it. And so having gotten rid of the spotted knapweed, this is what we see in its place. A short grass prairie dominated by side oats grama, little blue stem, and prairie dropseed, and a variety of wildflowers, including, here we see, this is the purple prairie clover, also coreopsis, a whole host of the plants that we don't see in the tall grass prairie that have really done a nice job to convert this. And I would have to say that over the years that this has matured, when I look at this short grass prairie, I would have a hard time of anyone being convinced that this is not an original remnant site. It looks so much like sites that I've seen. It has really done a nice job to reestablish itself and mimic a natural community. We did introduce prairie smoke just as a little accent plant in a small area. This adds a little some diversity, a plant that we normally did not find in our area, but this came from more of the southern Kettle Moraine area. Just below that, that knoll was an area of, it was a kind of weedy area. There were some scattered red cedar trees, and it was sort of blocking the view. We did plant red cedars to the left side of this picture, which is right along the roadside, provide screening, but we wanted to open this up. So here I cut a few of those trees down, removed them. We burned off the old weeds and the dead material. And then I rototilled this just to make sure we completely fallowed it. We did not use any chemical on this. We just simply kept tilling and disrupting the material on top here. And then we broadcast the seed. Because there is a bit of a slope, we rolled it and then mulched it. And this then provided a decent seed bed for the establishment of a prairie, and it was able to tie together the site from that knoll and bring it right up to the house. And also, as I said, remove a few scattered trees to open up a bit of more of a sweeping view. So here we see that first year of growth, very typical of a prairie establishment, the last stump there from a red cedar. And basically the first seedlings are starting to take root, put up a little green. After that, we get that first flowering. We always put a little bit more of the black-eyed Susan in for some early color. Also, bergamot does well in those first few years. The great blue lobelia did extremely well in this site. In the background, you see dyer's weed, or this is gray goldenrod. So a nice mix of shorter grass prairie. And here we're looking from the top of that knoll down to the house where we had the scattered red cedar trees. We kept those off to the side with some dogwood bushes, and we now have that large open sweep and have tied together two prairie sites from the top of the knoll and the gardens down by the house into one unified landscape. Just below that prairie, and in the background, that's where that dry prairie is, up on that knoll behind the cedars. This is along the roadside. These are some of the red cedars we planted for screening. And under the red cedars, of course, buckthorn was coming in. The birds love to roost in there, and that's always a bit of a problem. They'll bring those seeds in, roost at night, and leave the seeds in their droppings. So we finally had the time to get to this site. We went in and we hand grubbed out all of the buckthorn and pulled out the small seedlings. And again, we started a small wildflower garden from things that were started in the greenhouse. So right along the roadside, we planted a wildflower garden. And here we see now our natural roadside. Again, I mow that little strip. I've got a small riding mower. We don't have any lawn. I just mow the trails and I mow the roadside. And I do that, first of all, it provides an intentional border so that when things aren't in full bloom, as I said earlier, it doesn't look like just neglected weeds. These are an intentional wildflower garden, gives it a bit of an edging. And also I've made a bit of a deal with the township. They don't mow this, I do. And the reason for that is I only mow 2 swaths wide. I maintain a nice open vista for safety for them. But when they come through with their machinery, they've got the big side-arm mowers, and they'd be mowing half of this down. So they've agreed to leave this alone as long as I take care of it. And it provides a little bit more of a narrower corridor. So we've done this as also an enhancement right along the roadside as a showcase for the neighbors, something that they can enjoy. And sometimes they'll even ask questions from us, and hopefully a way of subtly selling the idea to the neighbors to try something like this in their own backyard. Besides the wildflower gardens, we also have a vegetable garden that Connie works in throughout the summer. We had to fence this in to keep the deer out, of course. And this produces extremely well in a small area, all kinds of crops. And at the end of the year, of course, we get that bountiful harvest. So even the vegetable garden has done extremely well for us. And we eat as much as we can when it's ripe, or can the rest of it to get us through the winter time. So now we'll move into the woodland and show what we've done here to restore an oak-hickory forest. So this is that main portion of the property, that whole slope from the upper field going down to the edge of the lake and the marsh. And a large slope. The trees were left pretty much undisturbed because it was too steep to really log successfully. But as I said, the cows were in there. They had trampled it, they had grazed it, and as a result, they not only had eaten out or trampled out a lot of the understory, the wildflowers and sedges, but the stuff that they didn't like to eat came in very well. Prickly ash really came in, and also here you see the honeysuckle, and as we saw earlier, the multiflora rose. So honeysuckle was another problem we had in the woodlands. And here it is early in spring where the buds just starting to open. We did the exact same thing here as we did in the other part of the woods. First was to cut a corridor. This was an old cow path. So we chose that as our main trail. removed all the honeysuckle through this section, and then started to work from each side of it, slowly removing it. The biggest ones were taken out by a chainsaw. Some of these had a trunk diameter of 3 inches or more, so I just cut those down near the ground, and without disturbing more soil and too much labor, I just simply stump treated those. The smaller, medium-sized ones, I could just grub them out. They're not that heavily rooted, so with a grub hoe, or what's also called a mattock, you can just simply lean onto the plant a little bit, whack down by the root, and just pry that right out. A little bit of physical work, but it was pretty easily removed with some effort. We had so much of the honeysuckle that we removed out of there, including some extremely large ones. I dragged it out onto the field right on the edge where we're establishing our prairie, and I was afraid to light everything at once because we had such a massive pile. So I actually started cutting it a bit and doing a smaller bonfire just to get rid of all of this stuff. And once you get a fire going early spring, the honeysuckle stems are pretty dry. It burned quite well. So it was an easy way to get rid of that. Now, over the years, once we had removed the honeysuckle and multiflora rose, we had our trails, we got busy with other things. We worked on projects such as our pond, the banya, the garden, other prairie sites, and we didn't give enough attention to all the far corners of the woods and throughout some areas, and that's when the buckthorn started to move in. And buckthorn crept up on us very quickly. As anybody knows, it became very quickly established. And we finally, it took some while before we could give enough time and enough attention to it to really give it an effort. And so we've got a bit of a strategy we've developed. The first thing is we go in first with a chainsaw and cut the biggest ones. Those are the ones that are producing the fruits. That's what you want to get rid of first. So we had some of them that were 6, 8 inch in diameter, and lop those off at the ground and then stump treat it. Here I have a lop shears and also a chemical glove, and in the spray bottle that is Garlon, a stump treatment. Obviously we don't like to use a lot of chemical here, but I feel quite good with this that we're using a pretty conservative amount only on the stump. I'll either spray it like this or use what people call a buckthorn blaster, a little dabber, and just give the chemical just directly to that cut stump, because otherwise it'll resprout. And buckthorn has such a large tangled root mass that to try to rip it out, you're going to create an awful lot of disturbance to the soil, and also any plants that are growing around, you're going to have uprooting those as well. So in some cases where you've got a few scattered buckthorn with other wildflowers and plants still growing there, you're better off to keep the soil intact, just cut the ones out and treat those. So I cut the biggest ones out, then I move down in size class. Then I get out into areas where it's a little thinner, and then this is all mechanically or basically hand removed. And here you see my little grub hoe. This is a small one, like a little hatchet. Just get on your hands and knees and one whack, and you can just pop out the smaller ones. I do this primarily spring and in fall. And here you'll see the large dents stand in the background, and little at a time, just chip away at that. I cut and treat the bigger ones, anything that's more than chest high, and then the small ones just physically remove them. For the bigger ones, here's my bigger grub hoe, more like an axe. And this, I just one good whack at the right by the root, give a little pry on it, and they pop right out. I do buckthorn in fall only. And the reason for that is we're busy with other things throughout the season. We're usually planting things and taking care of things in spring. In summertime, there's a lot of work to do there, and it's just not the best time to look for buckthorn. But in the latter half of October, early November, everything else has turned brown, lost its leaves, and buckthorn is really easy to see. It holds those leaves until the first couple of frosts, and so that really late season is the time that they're easy to find, and also in that cool weather, it's easy to go after them. So this is the time what I call seek and destroy. We go out after buckthorn, and I will have to tell you that we started gearing up with buckthorn around the year 2000. It was on-off effort trying to control the biggest ones first and slowly make inroads. And then as we had more and more time, we started to give a more concerted effort. The last, say, 5 years is where we really started to gear up. And this last fall, we succeeded in removing every single buckthorn from our property. If there's anything out there, he's hiding somewhere, because I didn't see it. Now, it's not to say that once it's gone, that's it. It always comes in. The birds will be bringing it in because there's obviously buckthorn still in the neighborhood. And with that, we're always going to have it trying to creep back in. But I basically have gotten into a mode for the last 3-4 years. I patrol the property, what I call a Buckthorn Survey, or my monitoring. I take one section of the woods at a time, and I just walk back and forth about little transects about 5 feet apart, and I look for every single buckthorn I can find. I've got a good enough eye for it. I can find seedlings less than 2 inches high. If I should miss them in fall, during random work in spring, anything I see, I'll pull again. And I'm not as thorough in springs. I'm just, well, whatever I happen to find, I'll certainly remove if I miss them. I'm probably getting 90+% in fall. Get a couple here and there, the stray ones that I missed. If I miss them that year, by fall, they're now, those little seedlings will be 6 inches tall. I should be able to find them. If I miss them that year, the next year they'll be probably about 12 to 18 inches tall. Either way, they'll never set fruit on my property. They're not going to get that big. If I miss them the first year or two, I'll certainly find them within a short time. And so now it's suppression. It's just become an annual effort to, once you get it out, keep it out. And basically, it just hasn't been anywhere near the effort it took to get it out originally. And not only have we removed buckthorn on our property, we're working with Connie's sister next door. We've got 2/3 of their property done. There are at least 3 other neighbors that we've helped to get in, at least cut out their biggest ones. And when we work along the roadside, we always are talking with people, and we'll sometimes even let them know, hey, by the way, we're removing buckthorn. If you see this plant, you have it, get rid of it. If you need some help, just ask us. We'll give you any advice just to keep it. So it's become also a little bit of a lesson for the neighborhood. So here's what we had after the big ones were removed. The understory of our forest, there was a lot of scattered buckthorn, and this was going to keep growing on us. So once we got the big size class down, this is what we had to deal with, and this is where we removed it by hand. After we've done that, here's what you see. A natural open understory, that open aspect of a native oak-hickory forest. And this now has provided tremendous opportunity for the wildflowers just to come in on their own. And we also introduced a few things in there just to add a little variety. As I said, the buckthorn will always come back. This is actually a resprout. You can see a couple of stems. A root must have gotten snapped off, so he's trying to come back. He's only 3.5 inches high, but he's not going to get bigger than that. We'll kill him before he ever has a chance. Some of the areas where buckthorn was removed, where it wasn't too dense, we've actually pulled back the leaves and sprinkled in some seeds. We've gathered seed in fall and put in some of the wildflowers to help that reestablish. One plant that I find does extremely well in these open forest areas is early meadow rue. And in early June, the seeds don't stay on real long, but I hand collect it during that short time when it's ripe. They're tiny seeds. I'll get a nice little dish of them, and I'll just walk around these little openings and help to distribute it, move that around. A little later in the season, I'll gather the tops off of Solomon's seal and Solomon's plume. I'll scatter those berries around. And also Jack in the Pulpit, I'll throw those around a little bit, or sometimes I just give a kick to the little berry clusters and watch them scatter in the woods. And another plant that we've really had success with is what's called tinker's weed. Some people may know it as feverwort. It has these little orange berries that grow in the axil of the leaf. Originally, I found only 2 plants on our land. That's all there was. And every year I've collected those berries and I put them out where there's a little more sunlight. These were in quite a shady area. And I just keep gathering those. This past fall, there were probably 100 plants. They were all over the property. Nowhere were they dense, just a few here and a few there. But we've been very successful in just scattering those seeds and helping it to grow in many different areas. And there again, just mix things up, because some of these seeds just on their own don't disperse real far. So if you've got a nice cluster in one corner and you've just grubbed something out somewhere else, move them, give an advanced start. We've also employed fire in our oak forest. That was always natural in the oak forests. And we've done this to rejuvenate that understory. It's also helped to kill some of the buckthorn seedlings. And about 5 years ago, there was a super crop of sugar maple seeds. And it was not just our property, but all throughout southeast Wisconsin. There was just the perfect growing conditions. The trees produced super abundance of seedlings, of seeds that year. And we had some really good overwinter and spring growing conditions. And we had a carpet of seedlings of maple growing. I don't want a lot of maple in my woods because I want to see more oak regeneration. And maple do not tolerate fire the way oaks do. Where I had a carpet of maple where I didn't want it, low flame like this in early spring when the leaves are dry, it just toasts them and it just got rid of them. So it's a way to, again, use fire as a natural force. After the fire in early spring, everything has been burned down. We got a little bit of the leaf litter gone. And then here we have that open aspect of a nice restored oak-hickory forest from what was a pretty weedy area dominated by these non-native shrubs. Now we see that given space for native wildflowers. Hepaticas have come back tremendously, and we've always had a nice little stand of it, but we now have a whole carpet of it after several decades. And during that short 2 weeks or so in early spring, it's really quite a sight to see just this lush abundance of hepatica that carpet one whole corner of our forest. Bloodroot is another plant that has done very well. We had none in our forest, but right around the corner, a neighbor had it growing right along the edge of the roadside. And there was no shoulder on the road, and sometimes on a narrow road when cars would pass each other, they drive right over the edge of the flowers. So we asked if we could just simply rescue those and just move a few into our property. Originally, I think we moved about 24 plants, watered them, took good care of them, and they started to spread on their own. And they have moved throughout the entire forest without any aid from us. And we've got this a tremendous carpet. But like the prairie, things change. And for a few years, we had this whole spread of it. And then something, whether it was weather condition or maybe a disease, I think it might have been the winter weather for some reason, it knocked it back. It really set it, became more sparse, and now it's coming back again. So these are the natural cycles in the forest. Some plants will do well for one season or two, and things sort of come and go. Jumping worms, somebody's asking about that. I have not seen them here. We don't know of them in our area. And of course, we keep a watch for all kinds of invasives, and I'm sure that's just never going to quit. But here you see now the understory from a grazed out woodlot. This is what we have in spring. The May apples, the Trilliums are growing nice and dense throughout it. A whole variety of different plants that come for those spring ephemerals. Always enjoy Trilliums. This is just from a remnant little stand that we had. They're starting to spread on their own. I did plant a few into one other corner. We also brought in a little bit of shooting star. Another plant that we had a pretty good remnant of was the yellow bellwort. But this all on its own has, over the years now, has just spread and become really super abundant. It's not in any way carpeting it, but it's really some lush clusters of it. And from what was maybe a few dozen when we first started, is now really spread throughout big sections of the woods and really showing a nice health and restoration to the understory. A couple different kinds of violets. Here, common wood violet. And another plant that creates quite a carpet in the late spring and summer is wild sarsaparilla. We always had a nice little stand of that, and that is continues to grow throughout the woods. I'll finish up with a little bit on our wetland, and that is that area then below the slope of the forest between us and the lake. And so this is a nice mix of wetland with willow and dogwood shrub cars, some scattered tamaracks. There's lowland forest in one corner, and then it opens up toward the lake to more sedge meadow and blue joint grass. There's also a couple of springs, one small seepage spring and one that actually forms a little creek from right below the hill. And so this adds a little bit to the variety of plants that grow there. This is a blue joint grass and sedges. And of course, you can barely even get a canoe into the edge of this, and you certainly couldn't walk in it. The only time we could even walk in here was in wintertime, in early spring when the ground was frozen. So for us, access was really limited to just the wintertime that we could even walk into here to explore it. And we never knew what was growing there. So many years ago, I made a small boardwalk, just simply cutting a few logs, laying those down. I checked with my colleagues at DNR. At that time, no permits were even needed for this. It was considered, and still is, very low impact. Just lay a few sections of log down, put a 2x12 over it, and it makes a narrow boardwalk. I eventually created, it took 3 seasons to do so because I only built this in early spring, and eventually have a boardwalk of 420 feet that makes a loop trail around here and comes out by our little campsite. So this gives us access into a corner of the property that we've just never been able to come into except for that wintertime. It's got a nice carpet of the marsh marigold and skunk cabbage in springtime. This is our little spring-fed creek that starts right below the house. And just a lush stand of the marsh marigolds that bloom for a while in springtime. The skunk cabbages come up very early in the season, and by early summer, the leaves are huge, almost like tropical plants. They create quite the jungle. And we found also wild iris growing there. And to our real surprise, which we never knew, we've got orchids. Dwarf yellow lady slipper orchid grows in our marsh. And this one, I don't know how many or how they're doing, because they're such tiny plants. And when the skunk cabbage comes out, they get pretty easily masked among the tall sedges and skunk cabbage and other forbs down there. But I can usually count at least 2 or 3 dozen just off the boardwalk, and no doubt there's many more. And even more surprising, we've got showy lady slipper. Showy lady slipper has come and gone. We had some really lush stands of it, but unfortunately, this is also very delectable to the deer, and they've been browsing it out. I have been fencing a few of them out, and like anything else, I'm sure it has its cycles that they come and go, but I'm trying to reduce that deer impact. Something else that also keeps us out of the swamp, you might notice between these 2 stands of lady slippers, that's poison sumac. We've got a nice stand of poison sumac, which keeps everybody right onto the boardwalk. So here's our orchids in a nice bloom in early summer. And as I say, a plant that we never even knew we had until we had the boardwalk there that give us that access and chance to get in. So here we have a nice trail, adds a little bit to the trail system, that boardwalk to be able to walk through the wetland. So over the years, we've been able to work with the land to restore the oak-hickory forest, to plant the prairie, to work with wildflower gardens around the house, and also to watch the forest itself mature. The trees have grown much denser than before. The trees are certainly much larger than they were when we first moved here more than 35 years ago. And the variety of plants, from what has come in on its own and a few things that we've helped along the way or even introduced as the prairie, we've really got quite a diversity on this very small piece of land. And we've created opportunities for lots of wildlife. So the prairie itself is quite a large butterfly garden, so red spotted purple. We've certainly tried to grow a lot of milkweeds of several different species. The monarchs are there every summer, tiger swallowtail, and altogether I've now cataloged 28 species of butterflies in our prairie and forest. Also dragonflies, and I'm not that good with my insects, but I've identified a dozen species of dragonflies. And there's a whole host of invertebrates. I need an entomologist to help out. And no doubt there's hundreds of other species there that have so far been unidentified, but they all make a home here, and we feel responsible for all of them and have given them a place to live. We've got also a nice variety of mammals, the woodchucks, red squirrels, gray squirrels, and 1 or 2 fox squirrel that occasionally come in. Cottontail rabbits and deer are all part of the fauna. We've also got flying squirrels, which were a real treat when we discovered that we had them coming in, and here a couple of them at the sunflower feeders at night. Deer are certainly a mixed package. I enjoy deer. They're nice to see. However, the deer themselves, they can be a bit of a problem with their browsing, and so when you get a few of them that make their home here, they can do a lot of damage to a forest. So I try to control the deer numbers. I put up my tree stand during the bow and gun season, and annually I try to remove a few deer from the property because I have seen the damage that they can do when they become too abundant. So with that, we help to control a population that is basically unnatural in terms of its high numbers because of agricultural land, and try to bring that into balance. Now, my specialty is birds, and that is certainly something I've studied more than any other group of plants or animals, and I've always enjoyed the great variety of birds. I do have wood duck boxes. We do raise wood ducks and also some hooded mergansers. The lake and wetland edges, they provide places for a variety of ducks in springtime. We do have bald eagles and osprey that will hunt the lake. There's a pair of at least one pair of bald eagles nesting in the forest. I believe there's a second pair now nesting north along lake, and a variety of herons and other water birds that come in. Cranes nest down in the marsh below the house, and they'll bring their young up into the prairie to look for food in the early spring and summertime. We've also got turkeys that are nesting in the state forest down the road from us. They've been bringing their young poults into the new plantings and look for insects in the early springtime. And throughout the woods, we've got just a whole host of year-round residents, including our blue jays and red-bellied woodpeckers, and lots of migrants that we host here. Among the different woodpeckers, I do have yellow-bellied sapsucker nesting here. And in fact, when I first documented them, I found that this was the first record of yellow-bellied sapsucker nesting in Fond du Lac County. So we do have them in southwest Wisconsin, and in the northern part, we've now got them in the northern Kettle Moraine, and I'm happy to have them on our own property. We also have pileated, or what people call pileated woodpecker, that nest across the road from us in the deeper forest, and they'll commonly come through our woodlot, which is always fun to see. And for studying of the birds, I am a federally licensed master bird bander, and so I've got the permits that allow me to capture marked birds, and we've been doing that on our property. It's a way to study them a little more intensively and a chance to be able to enjoy them up close. Here we've got a flicker in the hand that I'm attaching leg band to. But of course, having birds in the hand does come with its occupational hazards. So while they are a joy to see up close, you got to handle with care. And here's a little host of some of the variety of birds we have. By the way, our total list, I've now cataloged 209 species of birds on our property. And we'll just show you a couple of them, which includes our scarlet tanager, indigo bunting, the black-throated green warbler, rose-breasted grosbeak, and nice variety of warblers, black and white warbler, blackburnian, golden winged warbler. A couple more warblers, the magnolia, Cape May, and nesting down below the house, we do have the common yellowthroat. We have hummingbirds that nest on the property. And also down in the marsh, we have yellow warblers that nest along the forest edges, the catbirds and the rufous-sided, or now the eastern towhee. And down in the marsh, we do get migrant Canada warblers that come through. We also have wood thrushes and Baltimore oriole in summertime. These two pictures I did not take in our backyard. These I took down in Central America. So here's my backyard birds on the wintering ground. And nice to know that I have this connection with birds that I host here to raise their young in summertime. And I've been working in Nicaragua on a variety of bird conservation projects for the last 20 years. And as some of you probably know, I've also been leading birding tours to Nicaragua, which I, of course, have postponed this year, but will again start next year February. So we'll go down and look for those birds. And thousands of miles they'll fly from those wintering grounds and spend the summer to nest in our backyard. We're enjoying the winter birds right now, and of course everybody's favorite, I think, in wintertime are the cardinals, and sometimes we get them by the dozen coming in to take advantage of the feeders. And like anyone who's feeding birds in wintertime, the finches will come in. Some years the pine siskins and the red poles will also join in on feeders. And we not only feed the birds, but it turns out that a lot of the plantings that we have here are a natural food source. Right behind our little water garden, I maintain a stand of gray dogwood, and they produce a lush crop of berries that the thrushes and catbirds just love, and they don't last very long in fall time. Here is a hermit thrush eating on the berries, stripping them quickly, so we have a natural feeder right there as well. And of course, the birds come into the bird bath as well. So with food, water, shelter, those are the main requirements for good habitat. We provided all of them, both through natural settings and here artificial water. Now, of course, the birds are a joy to have, but they do bring their problems. We did side our house with wood, and here's a little downy woodpecker excavating in our siding. So we've had to just simply live with that. They don't do a tremendous amount of damage overall. This has been over years. We'll see them pecking on it a bit. We have replaced siding on one side with a little bit more of a synthetic material that looks like wood. But overall, we keep up with the minor amount of damage. But of course, we also have caused problems for the birds. And just by building our house, we found that our big windows, which provide a good view, are a serious hazard for birds. And as you can see on the window here, this is from a mourning dove. It's impression from the oil on its feathers as it flew into a window. And it really was disappointing to us that here we built the house as carefully as we could, landscaped it, blended it in, and yet our windows were a hazard for birds. And on average, we had almost once a month a bird that would fly into the window. Occasionally they'd kill themselves, sometimes they'd fly away, but you never knew the extent of the injury and whether they could recover. So we had to do something about it, and we have since put these strips on the window. This is a product called Kaleidoscape, and it's a Wisconsin company from Janesville. They do make a whole sheeting that goes over an entire window. I found it obstructed the view a little too much, so I had them cut them into little 1/2-inch strips, and it has an adhesive to it. So we just simply put this 4 inches apart. So when birds see that as a barrier, 4 inches seems to be a little bit too narrow for them to fly between, so they avoid it. And nowadays we have cut our the window collisions down to just about 0. The few that I've ever heard tap into the window seem to recognize that they just may not fit, and so it's been almost real low velocity. That once or maybe twice a year a bird will tap into the window but not slam itself into there and find it lying on the deck. So we really cut those hazards, and I would say to anybody, if you've ever had a bird hit your window, do something about it. This is a really good way to do it. 4 inches apart, some sort of a barrier, that's what you need to do. And so I think we probably all had window collisions. So yeah, we need to do something. We all enjoy the birds. We want to feed them, watch them, but we can't be creating these hazards. And so I've learned a lot from the birds, from watching them and studying them for over 40 years. Birds have taught me a lot, and it's also been my window of how I look at nature and how I look at my land. And so we provided a place for them to live, and they've provided for us a lot of lessons for nature. I kept good track of the things that we have tallied on our land, and so here's a little bit of a record of over the years what I've now discovered on our land. This is on less than 10 acres of land, 209 species of birds, 26 mammals, 6 reptiles, 10 amphibians, 10 species of fish that I found in the lake. It's 29 butterflies, moths. I know there are a lot more than 13 out there, but that's all I can identify. And a dozen dragonflies. As I said, give me a good entomologist out here, and I could certainly push that list up by another 100 or 200 species easily. For our plant life, won't go through all the categories, but all together from the plants that we've introduced, which is mostly the prairie plants, nearly 80 species, and a few woodland plants, and everything else is on its own, 360 species of plants. Between the plants and animals, I've now tallied 675 species on this less than 10 acres of land. When we talk about concerns for biodiversity loss, the first thing I think that comes to people's mind is the Amazon rainforest. And I've spent a lot of time exploring the rainforests and different habitats in the tropics of Central and South America. And yeah, they are some of the richest environments in the world. However, even here, our own landscapes in Wisconsin are incredibly rich if we take the time to actually count and tally what's there. So we're responsible for an awful lot. We've created a home, not just for ourselves, but literally hundreds and hundreds of species of plants and animals that we share this small piece of land with. And so this has become our home and our paradise and our experiment in restoring the land and learning to live with it. And after more than 35 years, here we find our house nicely blended in. And a little retrospect, we'll go back in time. Here's what the house looked like when we first built it. And here's what we find today. The trees have grown, the wildflowers have established in our gardens, and it's tucked in among the woods. Out in front of the house, that was that little ratty area that we took and tried a couple of experiments, turned into a water garden, and that's matured very nicely and blended in. And from an old cornfield, we turned that into our prairie. And we see the sweep of the driveway that is running right up through the middle with prairie on both sides. I mentioned about the sign that I gave Connie, designating this as our Birchwood Lake Nature Preserve. And well, over the years, even the sign itself has shown some weathering and wear. And we've seen as the prairie also has changed over that time. In order to protect the work that we've done, the efforts that we've invested in this, and to basically secure this in perpetuity, we entered into agreement with the Glacial Lakes Conservancy. Beginning in 2015, it took about a year to complete the process. We have since then have a perpetual conservation easement on our land. And so with that, working with the Land Trust, we have now provided permanent, perpetual conservation protection of this piece of land, and so that the work that we've put into it is something that will be maintained well beyond our tenure. And so with that, it's now been designated as one of the smaller properties, but certainly something that we found a good partner to help secure the efforts that we've done here and protect it. And so as we look out across our land, we're now looking at hopefully breaking out of winter soon and anticipating another spring season where we can get out there and work with the land and assess our efforts and see what other work there is to do. And over the years, we've enjoyed our reviews as we've looked out across our woods. And every year, watch some changes, watch some improvements, changes that nature have brought, and certainly the things that we have worked on and watched our own efforts mature. And it's really been a long-term experiment, and we've been fortunate not just to have a nice piece of land to work with, but to stay here for over 30 years and continue to work with it and to really plant ourselves here and to be a part of this land. And so we watch the seasons go by, we watch the work slowly mature along with ourselves, and we've come to learn some important lessons, and that is that when we work with the land, we develop a personal relationship with it. And through that relationship, as we change the land, we find that the land in turn will also change us. The land not only has matured, but so have we, and we've become much closer to this land as we've learned it in such great detail and a chance to work with it literally hand in hand over so many years. So I'm really glad to be able to share our experiences with you. I hope that you maybe take a fresh look at your land and get ready for this coming spring and do something there on your piece of land to plant some wildflowers, some native plants, and try to do something for wildlife, no matter what the scale of your land is. And I hope maybe some of the things I've shared with you here will provide some worthwhile hints for you. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill. That was, I think I speak for everyone in saying that that was great. Unfortunately, we've run a little bit over in time and we seem to be losing some number of people. And I think you have answered a bunch of the questions that have been answered. What I'd like to propose is that we can send out answers to all of the questions that were put in the chat to participants on the webinar so that those everyone can see answers to those questions. And if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to me and we can work to get those answered. So I don't want to hold you guys up too much longer.
I would be certainly glad to answer any questions by email that people might have. If you're interested, I'd be glad to help you in any way. So sure, if I can follow up with anything. As I saw some small chats come up, I tried to address those. So hopefully I've answered most all your questions. If there's anything else, I'd be glad to help out.
And just one last thing if you guys liked this talk, we're talking about more different topics related to native plants coming up. So register online on Eventbrite. And thank you everyone for coming. And thank you very much, Bill, for presenting.
My pleasure. Thank you.